Hello, I'm Rick from Penhayle Weathering, and it is my pleasure today to present to you some of the techniques I use for weathering my rolling stock. Weathering can be heavy or light, as shown in some of the examples here. It adds considerably to the overall appearance of the model. It can be done by one of a number of methods, commonly by airbrushing or by powders. There are other techniques available as well. I use one which includes a mapping pen, and what you're seeing here is examples of powder weathering with a little bit of mapping pen used to ink in the doorways and grills of the rolling stock in question. You can also provide a certain amount of extra detail, such as the water splash and rust on the side tank seen here. How much weathering you apply really depends on your personal taste and your need. Some items of rolling stock, such as the wagons here, are purchased ready weathered and can have additional weathering added to them, such as I have done here by rusting the wheels of the clay wagon and adding an extra layer of white powder to make it look more realistic. A selection of weathering items here includes a number of brushes. Soft natural fibre brushes are better than synthetic. I use hairspray for sealing, and those are a number of powders there, Monroe and AIM powders, also Cars if you can still find them. So I start by inking in the panels and the woodwork around the door frames using a 0.1 mapping pen. The natural daylight on this clip has washed out the effect slightly, but we will see it more clearly later on. This gives depth, and although it looks like a solid black line going in to start with, you can rub that ink around with a finger or a cotton wool bud, and that will work it into the cracks and the moulding lines where you want it to be. It will soften the effect. It will still give you the depth without looking quite so much as though you have just put on a solid black line. So this can take quite a while, depending on your rolling stock, and here with a wooden panel brake van, I'm going through all the corners. The ink is then rubbed in. That is a makeup applicator I'm using. Can use a cotton wool bud. And the finished effect looks as though it's got a little more depth to the panel work. So now I'm taking some pre-mixed powders. I do blend them, usually a mix of browns, black and grey, and just start to brush around, working into all the corners. A little goes a long way. Don't need a great amount on there. You'll see that some comes straight off, and that you will also see I am handling the item with a rag. In fact, I use old t-shirts, very good use for old t-shirts that. And I'm slowly building up the colour. You can see there's a different colour going on there for the footboards. The underframe is a dirty brown and black, and the footboards are in a lighter brown because they're made of wood. And then I'll start to build up the colour across the bodywork of the van, and just working a little bit into the details of the springs on the suspension and the axle boxes. So here we are back with the black and brown mix. Start to work it up the bodywork. Now this van is already got a spray of factory weathering on it, which is the grey coat at the bottom. I'm not a great fan of factory weathering because it is usually just an even spray. There are some honourable exceptions, but you can see that I am applying a fairly uneven coat of dirt across the body, and now we come onto the roof. And again, you can see where the factory weathering has just left a circle of black around the stovepipe, and I'm adding some more there just to give a generally used look about the roof in general. You can mix and match colours, that's just pure black going on there. Brush it around, work it into any nooks and crannies and corners. Try not to get it too even. If you get it too even, it looks like just a coat of paint at the end of the day. And there I'm putting some onto the ends of the van, which were often concrete slabs, as is represented in this case. Those splashes of colour are just a bit of unmixed powder. If that does happen, I'm not too fussed about it, because you can work it in, and natural weathering, as you see on rail vehicles in the real world, is very seldom an even colour. You do get splashes of all sorts of random colours. So those two spots of sort of reddish orange, you can see I've already worked them in, and I'm not worried about the odd bit of streaking. Now there's one of my patent weathering tools, the 1-inch house painting brush. Just go over it, work it in, and I prefer to keep it actually a little rougher than smoother. Moving on from wagons, we can tackle a small locomotive, such as here, the A1X Terrier class. On this one, I'm using a base coat of pale grey, just to take down that black shiny plastic effect first of all, before I come in with the real dirt. So that will just take down the sheen on the plastic and give you a layer of general grime on the tanks, on the boiler. If you want, you can keep it that colour, but in this case there's some black going on the smoke box, around the buffer beams, onto the cab roof, and more of the pale colour on the top of the tanks, around all the plumbing which you get on the top of a steam locomotive boiler. You often get water staining from hard water in such places, so a little bit of white there doesn't go amiss at all. And you can see that I've taken it down from that shiny black to very quickly a much more used appearance overall. It's important to get into all the nooks and crannies, places that sometimes get overlooked: the front of the cab, the coal bunker, the chimney. In this particular locomotive, I'm leaving the coal in its plastic form. Generally I replace it with lump coal, but in the case of the Terrier, the bunker is quite small. Now moving on to something a little larger, a full-size mainline diesel locomotive. Here on the left-hand side you can see at the extreme left the uninked grille, and next to it on the right-hand side the inked grills, so that was a comparison. And again we start with brown and black mix on the bogies and the underframes, the places which both receive and retain the most dirt. Even if the locomotive is fresh from the paint shops, it will usually have a little bit of grime down there. Now you can do the wheels. If you want to take the wheels out, you can blacken the wheels. Some items come from the shop these days with already blackened wheels. On this I'm not terribly bothered, because very little of the wheels actually shows. We need to keep the silvered surfaces for good electrical contact on the rails. If you do get powder, or if you're using paint, if you get paint on the wheel rims, on the contact surfaces, you can just clean it off as you go afterwards. So here I'm adding brown, a little bit of black around the fuel tanks. Again brushing it in with the good old house paint brush. And just adding dirt from the base upwards. So it's a very simple technique here, just brushing on the dirt. When you think about weathering, think where the dirt comes from. It mostly comes from the track, so it starts at the bottom and works its way up. The sides of the locomotive are usually relatively clean, except for the grills and recesses where dirt accumulates. So there's a little bit of rust going on the springs and brake cylinders there. That can be blended in so it doesn't look harsh. And just rub it around until you're reasonably happy with it. One of the things with powder weathering is if you're not happy, it does largely brush out. You can get rid and start again if you really need to, which is much more difficult if you're using a spray paint. So here I'm brushing the dirt up from ground level up the side of the locomotive and along, because you get dirt streaked along the side as the trains run. There's always a little bit of speed streaking involved. Moving on to the roof there, a little bit of black going around the exhaust ports. Brush it forward and backwards and move it around so that most of the roof has got a coating, but it doesn't need to be an even coating. And again on the bonnet covers in front of the windscreens. A little bit of care needed here because we don't want to turn the yellow ends black. We do want a little bit of grime on them in a moment. And you'll see that there is powder on the windscreens and it can be wiped off very easily as I'm showing you here. Again, that's the makeup applicator. A cotton wool bud will do the job just as well. Just wipe the dirt around a little, work it in, smooth out the effect. It doesn't matter what's on the rag at this stage. Here's another technique I use, showing the hairspray, a quick coat of hairspray on the roof and apply more black, and that will stick very nicely to and become a dull matte finish across the roof. You see how the ends are still slightly shiny, but in the middle the powder has grabbed onto the hairspray. If you're going to do it that way, spray first, powder later. If you spray on top of dry powder, all you will do is wet it, and that can affect the finished result. So moving on towards the front end of the loco here, done one end, we're doing the other. They can differ, they don't have to be identical. You seldom get identical weathering all over anything. And just going to give it a rub down the side here. Both works the powder in. It can also give it a little bit of a polish. Powder is extremely fine solid particles, so a wipe over like that can actually achieve a slightly dirtied, varnished look to your rolling stock. And now we'll do a little bit to the front end. Now we've got a snowplow fitted to this end of the loco as well as the normal yellow end. Snowplow is going to end up quite dirty. And always get some on the buffers. If you want to put grease spots on the buffers, that's fine. I sometimes do that with a dab of black acrylic paint. Sometimes I'll just do it with the mapping pen. You notice there that one of the air hoses has come loose while I've been brushing on the weathering powder. That's an easy fix with a spot of poly adhesive after you've done the weathering job. But not too much on the yellow ends, otherwise they will look dirty black. Which they did get dirty, but they're not always absolutely filthy. So I'm just touching up the end of the job here, again wiping over the windscreen. Clean up the glazing where it's needed. Nothing stuck to it at this stage. Just give it a wipe over. And as a quick job, I'm reasonably happy with that. And we can move on to a China clay wagon. This is also bought factory weathered, but now you can see I'm using the excess on the rag to just dab onto the tarpaulin and create random dirt spots. I'm adding some more grey, I'll add some more different colours in a moment as well. There's some black being sprinkled on there just by shaking the brush. And we'll work that in as well. Doesn't need to be brushed too hard on there. It will stay because it's a fabric material on that particular cover. And there's a little bit of rusty brown going on as well. Again, just working that in, and very quickly we have a finished result. Here we see the lineup at the end of a quick demonstration. There's the Terrier, the Class 37, the clay wagon with a couple of its stablemates, all perched on the viaduct which I use for display piece at exhibitions. There's the clay wagons and the brake van which I completed earlier. And that will conclude our demonstration.